Hey guys, welcome to part 1 of our discourse analysis tutorials. This will be a series of about 10-minute video tutorials to be able to show you how to do every step of a discourse analysis and how to do it well. Although we're going to spend a couple extra minutes because right now in part 1 we're working on propositions, and propositions are actually going to be the foundation of every text that you study for discourse analysis. And the reason for this is because every discourse or text that you look at is going to be made up of 1, paragraphs, and 2, propositions. So in order for us to rightly understand the context of any paragraph we look at, we've got to be ready to break that paragraph up into its individual propositions. Now, this idea of context is very important in and of itself because a lot of the times when we use the word context, we really actually mean the individual paragraph within the text. That is the immediate context of what we're looking at. And that paragraph is made up of propositions. So what is a proposition? Well, a proposition, you can start to think of it as one coherent unit of thought. For example, John 11:35, Jesus wept. Here's a couple other examples of propositions. In John 1:1, I've got the statement, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. And my third proposition, and the Word was God. Now, just from the very beginning, when you just start to feel this out, right away you can feel out that these are 3 different propositions. Especially look at proposition 2 and proposition 3. Even though these are worded very similarly, and the Word was with God, I know that's a very separate and distinct proposition than saying, and the Word was God. So you can see that these are separate. Now let's come back up here to John 11:35 for a moment, and let's just kind of see how this works. Now this is probably the shortest proposition that you will see in the New Testament, or at least tied for shortest. So I've got the statement here, Jesus wept. Now if I were to remove the second word, all I have is a noun or a name by itself. You can kind of feel that this is not really a proposition if all I have is just a name standing alone. On the other hand, the seminarian who wants to delete Jesus from his sermon or delete Jesus from his proposition, yes, all you have is weeping. You don't have a valid proposition or a valid sermon. If you put Jesus back, I have a subject and I have a verbal idea. Now I've got a coherent proposition, and we're ready to look at another one. In Romans 3:23, this is a really good example of how propositions generally work. Here I've got one proposition, all have sinned, and then the second proposition, they fall short of the glory of God. But notice this. In my first proposition, I have only one verbal idea. All have sinned, beginning with a connector, for or because, and then I have the second one, they fall short, and then the connector, and. So generally speaking, this is what you're going to see. You'll have one verbal idea, beginning with one connector, and the same thing with my other proposition, one verbal idea and one connector. So let's start to think of a proposition as being one complete verbal thought. And you also need to know that those can occur in every kind of sentence, whether it's a question, statement, imperative, any kind of flavor of sentence you can think of. You're going to see different propositions, and those propositions are going to be built by different verbs. So you could have an indicative, an imperative, all your infinitives, all your participles, whatever it may be. And the reason that I'm really hammering this point home is because whenever you see an indicative and then an imperative side by side, you're probably not looking at a single proposition. Those are probably 2 separate propositions, and you need to be able to see how those propositions are separate. So that's the way the propositions are distinct, but we need to come back to this idea of paragraphs again and think about the unity between each individual proposition, because propositions are going to work together once again to form complete paragraphs. Very, very important. So if I look at the Genesis days here in Genesis 1, well, right away I can see I've got a little paragraph marker here. Now you might not have even thought of this before or even thought that they were useful, but in your own Bible study software or in your own printed Bible, you probably have paragraph markers that mark off the different sections of the biblical text for you. Now this in itself can be useful. I see I've got a paragraph marker that leads me all the way down to the end of day 1. Well, after day 1, what do I get? I get a new paragraph marker because now we're talking about day 2. That leads me all the way down to verse 8, where the end of the second day is. And then what should I get next? Well, I get exactly what I would expect, a new paragraph marker. So you might not have thought of this before, but even in your printed Bible or study software, paragraph markers are going to be one of your first clues to show you the context. And the reason that I bring this up is because when you grab the entire paragraph, now we start to ask the question, how is this paragraph built together, and how did the biblical author stack each and every proposition toward the point that he was trying to teach? Or in other words, toward the information that God intends to reveal to his people. This is extremely important. So right now, if you're beginning to think, hey, you know what, this is really easy, I know what paragraphs are, honestly, I'm going to say be careful, because if you cannot do this part well, if you cannot divide the propositions separately, and if you can't think about the way that those propositions build toward the teaching in a single paragraph, you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding the biblical text, and you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding a discourse analysis. So rightly dividing your propositions can literally be a helpful way for you to be rightly dividing the Word of God. So let's come down now to some hard and fast rules that we can look at to be able to divide up these propositions. First, I'm going to take my biblical text. I'll take the first paragraph of Genesis 1. And I'm going to first start out by just breaking up our propositions by field. Now, this is actually going to be the easiest, but also the least precise way to start dividing your propositions. So it might feel like we're taking a shortcut right now, but this is how you do it when you start out. And then the second pass, we're going to use a little bit more precise rule. And then the third pass, we're going to really tighten it up and lock it in. So this is a good way to start out, though, but just know it also is, again, the least precise when you first start out. So by no means is this going to bring you all the way home. You've got to pass over your DA several times and really think about how it works by reviewing it repeatedly. But if you understand what the author is thinking, this is going to be a good way to start out. On the other hand, if it's an unfamiliar passage, or maybe it's a complex passage, or if you're even studying English Bible and English is not your heart language, this is going to be a harder way to start out. So the second and third rule that we'll look at will be a little bit more precise to be able to see how this works. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to get rid of my paragraph marker for now, because I know I'm dealing with one paragraph, and I'm going to start to tab out separate propositions here. And let's just kind of get these tabbed together, just like when we're phrasing in Hebrew 3 or doing sentence flows in New Testament classes. I'm going to line these all up and just kind of see how they work. So let's start off by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That feels good. That's one complete idea. And the earth was formless and void. I've only got one verb here, so that's a good way to start. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. Good. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Let's look at this next one. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. I probably need to divide this to a new proposition, and we'll check it in a moment. Then I come down to the next line, and God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. There's a little clue that that's probably a new proposition. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. Okay, this is going to be a good starting point. Let's take this text down to rule number 2, and let's check our work, because right now we're just feeling it out. So I come down to rule number 2. Every time you see a verb, just slice a new proposition. So to start off with, we were just kind of seeing how it felt and seeing what sounded like a complete idea. Let's be a little bit more precise now, because again, as a rule of thumb, propositions are only going to contain one verb, and this is the second easiest, but it's a more precise way to divide your propositions. So I've got, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, one verb. And the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Let me come back to this one for a moment. Even though the earth was formless and void, don't be afraid of those two different ideas, because I've only got one verb. The verb was is pulling double duty for both adjectives, formless and void. So that's okay to leave that. Let's come down to this one. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Good. Then God said, let there be light. Actually, here I've got a little problem. God said, that's a verb. Let there be, that's an imperative or a command, another verb by itself. So I'm going to need to divide this out into a new proposition, tab it over, and then I'm ready to go. And this is going to be a rule for discourse analysis in general. Anytime you see someone speaking, and then you see the content of the speech, Those are going to be two separate propositions. Notice after the quote, I've got a comment about the quote, and there was light. So I know it's a separate proposition. It's not part of the quote. Let's continue on. And God saw that the light was good. Well, I can break this up. God saw, there's a verb, that the light was good. What did God see? New proposition. God saw, verb 1, that the light was good, verb 2. Or in other words, you can think of this as, this is the main verb, and this is the object of what God saw, beginning with the connector, that. And what did God see? Well, it's got a verbal idea inside of it, and that's okay, but this is going to clearly be a separate proposition. And then God separated the light from the darkness, called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning. Well, right there, notice I've got the connector, the verb, the connector, the verb. So I need to put the new connector and the new verb on its own line. Now I'm ready to go to rule number 3. Rule 3 is the last rule for separating our propositions. Rule 3 is going to be to check for keywords and assign one proposition for each key word. So when we say keywords, we're talking about the keywords that are going to help us see the connectors at the beginning of each statement or proposition. Things like and, or things like then. Now, here's a very useful tool that everyone should be able to use. We've got this tool called Discourse Analysis Tool. Everybody in class should get this because whenever I'm, on the go, I always have this with me. I just go to the help section, click the help documentation, and then I can come over to the discourse analysis definitions here. Now, right now, you've got all these different kinds of propositions. You're going to learn about those later. But for right now, let's just focus on the key words. Anytime you see a keyword like and, moreover, furthermore, or something like then, and, or, but, while, these are going to tell you that you've got a keyword that starts a new proposition. And that's going to be the most precise way to see how these work. So if you see a proposition that's maybe like a comparison, you might see a keyword like, or even as, just as, so, or you might see what we call a negative positive, which would be not this, but that. So anytime you see these, we're going to just kind of get used to scrolling through the keywords, and this is almost like, it's honestly almost like cheating. If you can get these keywords and then just highlight them in your DA, you will really understand where the propositions are, and then you're ready to do a good discourse analysis. So let's look at it. The proposition in, or the connector in, looks like it's a proposition by itself, but this is going to be about the timing. So in the beginning is my whole concept here of time. We do have time connectors. I've got the basic connector and, I've got another and, I'm going to highlight these. And this is actually required for every DA that we turn in class. Keywords must be highlighted. Otherwise, we just have to take points away because you can't really understand a discourse analysis without looking at these connectors. So I've got all my ands highlighted, and God separated, and God called the light day. So now you're really starting to see I've got a whole lot of ands here in my discourse analysis, and this is making it really clear. But look at this. Right here, I actually have no connector for let there be night. Let there be light, excuse me. Then God said, let there be light. There's no connector. So actually, I'm going to mark this by telling myself I've got a 0 connector right there. That is extremely important that I know I don't have a formal connector there. Because everywhere else, I've got a time connector, conjunction, 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 then 0. This is huge. Anytime you see a 0 connector, those are often, not in this case, but often going to be the trickiest connections for you to figure out in your paragraph for discourse analysis. So make sure you always highlight your 0 connectors, and then I'm actually done. I have every single proposition separated. All my connectors are highlighted. I started off, let's just review quickly. I started off by first just feeling it out and saying, where is each complete thought in every line? Then I gave a second pass by saying, okay, where is the verb in each line? And anytime I saw a new verb, I just separated a new proposition. And then finally, on the third pass, and it's very important you look over your DAs multiple times, otherwise it's just so easy to miss points, but more importantly, it's so easy to misunderstand the biblical text, and that's really what we're here for. understanding the gospel and understanding how it's revealed. So finally, on the third pass, I'm going to look at every conjunction or connector by looking at my keywords one at a time, things like and, when, or like. And every time you see one of those, you just slice a new proposition, and then you're done. So the more you do this, the more you'll get the hang of it. So for right now, practice and enjoy, and we'll see you next time.